is that we examined the relationship or the association between psychotic illness and mass shootings, mass murder in general, over time. And what we found is that basically the percentage of mass shooters among mass murderers in general has gone down over time. So while the rate of mass shootings has increased, or the percentage or proportion of mass shooters with some sort of history of psychotic illness has gone down.
All right, welcome back to the podcast. I am joined today with Dr. Ragy Girgis. He is a Columbia residency psychiatry graduate, 2009. He had a T32 teaching grant during that. He now conducts clinical trials, high-risk psychosis research. He did private practice for a while, but now is full-time research. He is doing research as well in mass shooting, and so reached out to me and had some thoughts that he wanted to put out there. So we, had about 20 emails back and forth, and here we are today, going to break down what he considers the largest database on school shootings that exists, right?
That's right. Mass shootings, and actually mass murder in general. Yes.
Okay. And so just for my audience, like, what got you excited about this topic, or what kind of led to your interest in this topic?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. I really appreciate it. I've really appreciated the discussions that we've had up until this point, and I know that our next discussions, the ones that we're going to have over the next hour and a half, are going to be really wonderful. So thank you so much, and informative. I am a schizophrenia researcher. That's my primary area of interest. As you said, I conduct clinical trials and brain imaging research. And over the last several years, I became interested in violence and schizophrenia and violence, psychosis, how they're related, how they're not related. And I mean, most importantly, we all know that although having a psychotic disorder slightly increases the risk of violence, that increase in risk is very slight. The vast majority of violence is not perpetrated in general. The vast majority of violence in general is not perpetrated by psychotic people or people with mental illness in general, and especially mass murders. So we all know that. You're a psychiatrist, I'm a psychiatrist. People in the mental health field know that. But unfortunately, one might not appreciate that based on what one might hear or see in the media or other places. So our goal was to basically prove, using proper research methods and evidence-based data and research methods, that there is essentially minimal to no risk associated with or between mass shootings, mass murder in general, and psychotic illness. To do that, we basically put together this database. And again, we wanted to do it in a very systematic way, in a way that could be replicated, kind of like as if we were conducting a meta-analysis or a systematic review. And we've published this all now, but we, again, through a lot of work and systematic methods, compiled about 1,800 mass murders, which we defined by any instance in which three or more fatalities occurred in one event with no cooling off period. These included mass shootings, and were dominated by mass shootings. Mass shootings comprise about 65 or 70% of these mass murders, but also mass murders perpetrated with other methods, such as stabbings and those
Cars,
sorts of
bombs,
vehicles, bombs,
like
all those sorts of things.
And how far did you go back historically?
We went back to 1900.
Whoa. Okay.
And we examined mass murder all over the world. We limited our database to personal cause mass murder, which means mass murder that doesn't occur in the context of, for example, some sponsored terrorism or gang violence or war or something like that. So someone could have a political motive for a mass murder, but that couldn't be group sponsored in a way or sponsored in any way. So this is just personal cause mass murder, which comprises the vast majority of, for example, mass shootings that people are aware of and are reported by the media. So we had about 1,800 of these. And another thing that we really wanted to do was compare groups. And that's really important because unless one, as you probably know, can compare groups, there are many variables that could, or characteristics that could maybe bias or confound or confuse a result. And that's why it's very important to compare groups as opposed to just looking at numbers in isolation. So our main comparison in our database and analyses was between people who perpetrate mass murder with firearms, otherwise called mass shootings, but with firearms, and they could use actually other methods in addition to firearms. But bottom line is one group committed mass murder with firearms, or at least one firearm, and then a group of people who, or a group of events in which no firearms were used. We found a number of things. One is that while 8% of the people among mass shooters had some sort of history of psychotic illness or psychotic symptoms, 18% among individuals who perpetrated mass murder without firearms did. So
okay, so 8 versus 18%. So 18%, so much higher in the people that did it without guns.
Yes, and why that's
bombs, stuff like that.
Yes, and why that's important is that not just the absolute numbers themselves, it's the comparison. And the question is there some specific relationship between guns or mass shootings and psychosis? And this shows that there isn't. There isn't. When people who are psychotic perpetrate mass murder, they tend to do so with methods other than guns. So there is not some sort of specific relationship between guns and psychotic illness. There are several other lines of evidence that support these findings. So one of those is that, as most people know, and as we also demonstrated in the paper, the vast majority, like 96% of individuals who commit mass shootings are men. That number is lower, still very high, of course, and the proportion of individuals who perpetrate mass murder without firearms is who are male or men is still very high. But when women perpetrate mass murder, they tend to do so without firearms. That's number one. Number two, when women perpetrate mass murder, they're psychotic or have a history of psychotic illness much more frequently. We're talking 30% or higher.
Wow.
And number three, speaking more to violence in general and its relationship to mental illness, but also related to this question of whether psychosis is related to mass shootings and gun violence in particular. The mechanism by which mental illness, especially psychotic illness, sometimes mood disorders and substance use disorders or substance in general, slightly increase the risk of violence among people in general, is by impairing impulse control. So impulse control is what we would consider in the kind of ego psychology realm of psychodynamics is an ego function. So impulse control is an ego function that most people have, and obviously this lies along a spectrum. So mental illness, especially psychotic illness, affective disorders, substance use disorders, impair impulse control. Research has shown that the effect of substance use, affective disorders, psychotic illness, mental conditions in general on impulse control is greater in women That is probably because young men, the people who generally perpetrate mass murder, already have problems with impulse control.
Hmm.
So all these lines of evidence support our own data and results and our general conclusion that psychotic illness does not have some sort of specific relationship with or to guns and mass shootings.
Okay. I want to step back a little bit and talk about the prevalence. So you said the prevalence was 7 per billion people from 1990 to 1970, and it's increased to 14 per billion people. Is that correct?
That's right. So the rate, and so these are rates. These aren't absolute numbers. These are rates, and I'm glad that you mentioned that. The rate of mass shootings per billion people between 1900 and 1970 was extremely constant at about 7, or like 6.8 or something like that, but about 7. The rate of mass murder perpetrated with other methods between 1900 and 1970 was exactly the same. I mean, incredible.
Wow.
Since 1970, the rate of mass shootings, again, per billion people, these are rates, has increased fourfold to
Okay.
20 per billion people. The rate of mass murder committed with methods other than firearms has increased twofold to 14. There's a lot to unpack here, and that means a lot of things, and that has a lot of implications. Specifically with regards to how that affects our thinking about the relationship between psychotic illness and mass shootings, is another result that we did include in our paper also, and that I'll share here. And that is that we also, and again, this reinforces the importance of examining mass murders over time and worldwide and all sorts of different types, is that we examined the relationship or the association between psychotic illness and mass shootings, mass murder in general, over time. And what we found is that basically the percentage of mass shooters among mass murderers in general has gone down over time. So while the rate of mass shootings has increased, the rate of, or the percentage or proportion of mass shooters with some sort of history of psychotic illness has gone down. So some more data supporting the thesis that psychotic illness and mass shootings don't have some sort of specific relationship or association. I will mention people with psychotic illness seem to be slightly overrepresented among those in the general population. However, that overrepresentation is very small and accounts for a very small minority of mass shootings. Furthermore, as you probably know, people such as my colleagues, Paul Applebaum, Jeffrey Swanson, other people, experts in the field, have already published very effective, clear, detailed strategies for decreasing mass shootings and gun violence in general among people with psychotic illness and mental disorders in general. Those strategies are effective, have been proven. All this is to say that while, again, the number of mass shootings that needs to occur for any cause needs to be 0, if we really want to make a difference in how often these sorts of events occur, we need to probably put more attention on and focus on other things besides mental illness.
Yeah. So I think when I look at that number, 7 per billion, I think to myself, like, that is a very small number. I mean, contrast that just to the general homicide rate of 6.5 per 100,000 in the US, Like, we're talking about a very, very small number. Yet, when I meet young patients nowadays, it is in their mind that this is a reality that they could experience in their high school, So it's like, I almost feel the fear has got into a place that's like, it's like every high schooler I meet, like, this is something that they talk about. Like, I have one patient who is proficient in firearms and yet would never post a picture of them shooting a firearm for the fear, or even talk about it with people, that they're proficient in this, that they've competed and stuff, because they're afraid of being labeled a potential mass shooter, right? And what do you think about that? Sort of like the level of fear seems disproportionately higher than the reality of like what would actually kill a young person.
I hear what you're saying. This is a very important observation. I'm glad you brought this up, and we've discussed it before. It's critical. One, I see the same thing, and I've spoken with many people, and people say the same thing. People are very distressed about this, and they should be. It's very distressing, and that in and of itself is important. The distress, to some degree, comes from the media's romanticization of gun violence, unfortunately, which even more unfortunately is self-perpetuating and self-reinforcing. It scares a lot of people, like you said, and it makes a lot of people just scared of this sort of thing. And it is very scary. I think there are very few people who aren't scared about it. Like I said, it's unfortunately self-reinforcing, and there are many other, again, lines of evidence and reasons why. Basically, there's a consensus among experts at this point, but one consensus strategy for decreasing mass shootings, especially the type of mass shooting that most of us are aware of, the school shootings, the very public shootings, which represent in themselves actually a minority of mass shootings, and hopefully we'll get to that in a bit, would be for media in general to stop publishing personal information or photographs or those sorts of things of individuals who perpetrate mass shootings and mass murders. That would have two effects. One, it would decrease the number of mass shootings. And I think most experts have come to a consensus about that. And number two, it would decrease the fear that we all live in that we're going to go through one of these things. It is possible, and we should be scared. These shouldn't be happening. Even 28 per billion, and that's events. That's not victims. That's events. Is way too high. The majority of these do happen in America, so that rate is a worldwide rate. The rate, obviously, in America would be much higher. I guess it would be if we have about 5% of the population, it'd be 5 times that. So it'd be approximately 150 per billion. And these sorts of things should never happen. And they often target, unfortunately, the people who are most vulnerable, young people at schools and
Right.
and those sorts of things. It's very scary.
And I want to say to my audience is that like the left side of my brain that's more like kind of just pure reason is like, I shouldn't fear this. This is not something that's going to lead to my death, right? The other side of my brain, I was living in like San Bernardino area after the San Bernardino shooting. And I specifically remember like not wanting to go to parades, not wanting to go to farmers markets, not like when I go to a grocery store, like kind of situational awareness was elevated. When I go to a coffee shop, I would sit in a place where I could see the front door. Like I had a plan on what I would do if someone came in with a gun. So there's like the emotional reactive side of me, right? And then there's also like the reason, like, okay, like the reality is that this is a very, very rare event. The place that it takes place the most often is on the media. I'm afraid that even if news stations stop talking about the person, someone is going to. Like on TikTok, I remember after the last shooting, like there's a lot of people who were gaining hundreds of thousands of, fans a day from reporting very closely what was going on. Every detail is scrutinized. And there's just like this obsession that we have in America over like, well, tell me everything about this person that did this event. Some of the most downloaded podcasts are true crime podcasts, right? So it's like there's a hunger and an appetite for this. But what you're saying is that somehow that we need to educate people to not talk about or to glorify, right? Is that what we mean by the romanticization of like, it's the shooter that's romanticized and like spoken about so much that it gains them so much attention that it leads to like almost like an increase in future shooters by that sort of attention that's given. Is that what you're talking about?
That's definitely part of it. That goes into motive. And first, I want to correct the number. I said since the U.S. represents about 5% of the world's population, the rate in the U.S. would be something more like 150. That it would actually be more like somewhere between 4 and 600 per billion. But yes, going to definitely again a lot to unpack, which is fantastic. If so, well, first I'll say this: asking the media to stop reporting on personal characteristics. They can still report about the event, but asking the media to stop reporting on personal characteristics and sharing photographs of perpetrators is not a big ask. Think about how they do that when any sort of news story involves a minor. Very simple, very simple. They do that already. So that's not a big ask, and that then would, if the media then were to stop reporting on those things, secondary media in these cases, or secondary news media like other sorts of social media would follow suit. So I don't think that would be a big thing. Now, back to the romanticization of gun violence. Yes, news media or any media reporting on these events, and in particular, sharing personal information about perpetrators, is an indirect way of romanticizing gun violence. Although that I think speaks more to the direct motives that a lot of these school shooters and especially the public shooters have. Again, it's a consensus, I think, among experts that a lot of the motives, or a large part of the motive, motive is complicated and multifactorial, but a lot of the motive for perpetrating mass shootings among many of these, especially young males and whatnot, is their desire for notoriety. A lot of them are very down and out, very empty. Many of them have decided to end their lives. Again, somewhere between 30 and 50% of these individuals suicide during the event or the attack. So they've decided to end their lives. They're empty. They feel rejected by the world, whether or not the world is actually rejecting them. So they feel that society is rejecting them. They feel very angry about society. They're deeply narcissistic, and they crave notoriety.
So define deeply narcissistic. Like what are we actually talking about?
They think they're,
because I know it can be used in like popular terminology where I'm curious what you mean by it specifically.
in this sense, these young individuals feel that they're maybe much more special than they in certain ways than they otherwise are, and basically deserve some sort of, again, fame or notoriety in a way that is not consistent with their accomplishments or who they are, what they've produced. It would be normal for a world-class individual who's accomplished a lot, whether a scientist or an athlete or something else, to expect some sort of notoriety. That would be expected. They've accomplished something great. But unfortunately, there are a large number of people who have not necessarily accomplished anything for which they would expect society to deem them as famous,
Right.
who think
It's
they
like
deserve that sort of fame.
and committing a mass shooting instantly moves them from someone that no one will pay attention to, potentially no girl would date. Maybe they're ostracized and kind of like a loner, and rejected. They feel this rejection, and I think it's important that you specify that it could be the rejection by everyone could be also not quite reality, right? Like there could be Like I'm thinking specifically how often depressed people think that they have less social contacts than they really do. So they have this sort of nihilistic viewpoint that leads them to this despondency of like, okay, how do I gain notoriety? And look, the public has this solution: gain notoriety right away by committing this horrible crime. So that's kind of your thought, or would you change anything or add some nuance to any of that?
No, you got it. And unfortunately, you're exactly correct about all of that. Uh, by definition, what they're feeling is not based in reality. Often, including the rejection, often that does occur in the context of some sort of romantic feeling. And again, unfortunately, most people are aware that one way to gain a lot of notoriety and infamy, especially if you're planning on ending your life very soon, is to perpetrate a mass shooting in an environment such as a school or some sort of public place. Unfortunately, that is what it comes down to, and this is what probably the majority of experts in the field think at this point. All the more reason why we really have to ask the media to stop giving a platform for these people, even after death. Even after death.
Yep. Yeah. I know. I think it's kind of like the how the ape, when they see a snake, they stop and watch the snake, right? And they call their buddies over to watch the snake, and they'll stand there for like 2 hours watching this big snake, keeping a little distance, but they'll watch the snake. It's like, or like, just naturally we want to focus on negative things. Like our brains are kind of wired that way so that we can like potentially protect ourselves. And I think so in that way we have this like fascination with these perpetrators of these horrible acts, because they're so horrible and so just absolutely like heart-wrenching, right? Children, nothing is worse than the killing of children. It's just like absolutely just disgusting. And so we just naturally give an inordinate amount of attention. It's like, how do we change ourselves, educate ourselves? It's like, how do we sort of, as a culture, say like, no, we're not going to do this anymore? I don't know. Do you have any more sort of reflections on that? Or
you're right again. It's hard not to be drawn in by these sorts of stories. Just like it's hard not to be drawn in by any story that's so hard to believe and is impossible to even really fathom for 99.9999% of people. And again, unfortunately, the perpetrators know that. The media probably knows that, and the media probably know that. And again, we would ask for media to stop reporting on personal attributes of these people and stop publishing their photographs. That should do something. It won't stop all mass shootings, but that would be a start. And then there are obviously other strategies that we can talk about, and that would affect other types of mass shootings. Like I mentioned, the school shootings, those very public shootings, actually comprise about 10 to 50% of all mass shootings. In America, especially, 25% of mass shootings happen in the context of some criminal act. And again, not gang related, not otherwise, but they usually involve someone with a gun, often planning to, for example, commit some crimes such as theft or something like that. And in that context, having to, in their eyes, perpetrate a mass shooting in order to make sure they don't get caught or that type of thing. That actually comprises about 25% of mass shootings in America, and that is unique among America. That is not seen in other countries. That is quite unique about America. Another
wait,
fifth.
say that again. What's unique about America? Say that again.
So when we examine mass shootings across countries, this particular type of mass shooting, or motive, if you want to say, for mass shooting, the kind of criminal motive or the mass shooting occurring in the context of a crime is quite unique to
Quite
America.
unique. Okay.
Quite unique.
Interesting.
That's not seen as much in other countries.
Huh.
The other type of mass shooting that is seen all over the world and comprises about, including America, and comprises about 50% of mass shootings is the type of mass shooting in which some middle-aged man undergoes or goes through some sort of severe acute life stressor, such as loss of a job, loss of all of their money, separation from their partner, has their partner leave them or something like that. And they, again, very acutely, like just, in the moment, gain access to a gun and usually kill their family, their close ones, and then usually generally themselves. And a lot of these people don't have mental illness of any sort. I mean, most mass murders in general don't have mental illness, especially mass shooters. Most don't, but this type also generally doesn't. But a lot of them, if not most of them, tend to suicide. And then, like I said, they kill their family members or close acquaintances in the context of what's going on in their lives.
So I've thought about that statement, like most mass shooters don't have mental illness. And when I posted this publicly, I think I got this huge sort of uproar of like, well, how could you say that there's not something psychologically wrong about these people? And so I think, can you differentiate something being psychologically wrong? We've talked about them being more narcissistic, fragile egos, this entitlement, this sort of some fixed thoughts, isolation. Like that seems like there's mental health issues going on, but how do you differentiate that between like your statement, most of them don't have mental illness?
This is, I think, the crux of the issue, especially for us and for people listening to this podcast, I imagine, I guess, and for society in general. But this is the crux of the issue. I think there are a couple of things going on here, and we will go into the psychological side of it for sure, because that's what's important. But to back up even further, go more upstream of it. One thing I've discussed in a number of forums, including in a book that I wrote a year or two ago, is that a lot of people, I mean, this is probably obvious, but a lot of people don't understand what mental illness is for a number of reasons. I think a lot of people still equate mental illness with immorality, bad behavior, demons, Satan, those sorts of things. If someone believes in those sorts of things, I think that's kind of the first hurdle we need to get over, and I think that's a large part of this. There really are a large number of people, a large minority, if not a majority of people, who really think that mental illness is seen as a moral failure and related to sin and those sorts of things. It isn't. Bad behavior is most often not caused by mental illness. Bad behavior has a lot of causes. But I think that's the first step. We have to realize that mental illness is not equivalent to bad behavior or sin or demons or anything like that. I speak from a perspective of being a Christian and caring a lot about my community, and then writing the book that I wrote a few years ago, knowing that probably the majority of people in my own community do believe that mental illness and sin and bad behavior are kind of, if not one and the same, very closely related. And I've tried to fix those sorts of misperceptions.
Yeah. You've tried to sort of talk to the audience that believes different than you, that is, probably a more sort of less educated, not educated in the science of mental illness and the studies and the brain stuff that goes on and the neurodevelopmental consequences of mental illness. Yeah, when I'm talking to people like that, it's like sometimes really hard to get through, and sometimes I start with delirium because even their grandma can have delirium, and they're
Yep.
not going to believe their grandma's possessed all of a sudden acutely when they have a urinary tract infection. Sometimes I go from there to try to talk to them about, um, you know, therefore there are these diseases like schizophrenia probably being the one most commonly associated with like demons, where they have very sort of, spiritual themes often in their hallucinations and delusions. But, you take a schizophrenic patient who all they read is Dostoevsky and they believe they're in some sort of Dostoevsky novel. And you take them and put them into, I've treated some psychiatrists over in the Middle East, more coaching, not actual like therapy, but coaching. And these psychiatrists will tell me like all the delusions and hallucinations are around Muhammad, you know,
Hmm.
and Islamic themes. So is that kind of what you're saying, or is there other sort of things you're mixing into that as well?
That's exactly what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying. That a lot of what you're describing are the context, and that's part of the reason why a lot of people think that mental illness and and sin and Satan, those sorts of things are kind of one of the same. There's the contents of delusions and hallucinations, and it's often religious because religion is important to a lot of people, and so obviously the content is going to reflect that. It doesn't mean that religion and mental illness are the same, or there's a causal relationship or a cause and effect relationship between them, especially between sin and mental illness, or vice versa. It doesn't logically make sense. It's certainly not scientifically or neurobiologically, and I mean it's hard to get people to, including educated people, probably maybe not obviously people within the field, although many within the field, but certainly and hopefully not people within the field who are also religious. But I think that's one major hurdle, and it sounds like you also understand that's kind of an issue. Uh, anyway,
Yeah,
so that's kind of,
but
sorry.
but
Go
bring
ahead.
bring that home to where we're talking about mass shooters and mental illness. And okay, so most people don't understand what mental illness is. Mass shooters, according to you, largely don't have mental illness, but they have something else. Do you consider a moral component? Maybe we'll not jump there quite yet, but you can answer, kind of bring it home with what you're talking about there.
Right. Well, I will tell you. I will tell you. I do think there's a moral component to mass shootings and killing people and doing bad things like that. I think at some point, you know, uh, I definitely don't think mental illness is involved in the majority of these, and for the most part, and in most cases, mental illness, if a perpetrator has mental illness, it's incidental. And we've actually also shown that in the paper that in most cases, it seems like mental illness is actually quite incidental. I think this, at some point, evil just, takes its course. And this is maybe going to get to the next part of the discussion, what we're going to talk about, and what you were kind of referring to about the ego and impulse control and ego functions and all these sorts of things. And that is that, in at least in the psychodynamic world, and obviously, as you know, but maybe for other people, there are different theories of the mind and ways of thinking about how the brain works and motivations and what we call psychodynamics and whatnot. Uh, but there are kind of many ways to look at this. For one who isn't, and I imagine a lot of people obviously aren't religious. The way we think about it from at least a psychodynamic perspective, and certainly as we were discussing before, being a Columbia trained psychiatrist myself, I tend to see things from the psychodynamic perspective. Not that I'm not affected and think very highly of many other perspectives. I was just most influenced by the psychodynamic perspective. And so we see things in kind of the Freudian way, the Kernbergian way, and those sorts of ways. Uh, there are what we call ego functions, and ego functions are characteristics and traits such as our ability to manage to manage our anxiety tolerance, to maintain stable affects or moods, to plan. Cognition is an ego function. Impulse control, our ability to control our impulses, is an ego function. The id is or represents our fundamental and maybe slightly more primitive drives. And then we have a superego, which other people might call conscience and those sorts of things. Also, balances the id and helps control things. Either way, what we know for sure is that, see, this seems obvious, but people who commit mass shootings and these sorts of very, very, very kind of tragic events have difficulties with impulse control. Mental illness can affect impulse control, like we've discussed, although again, most people who commit and perpetrate mass shootings and mass murder in general don't have mental illness. So where does impulse discontrol come from? I mean, this is the nature versus nurture thing, but for a number of reasons, chronic life stressors or even acute life stressors can affect our ability to control our impulses. Everyone functions at different levels of, again, from the psychodynamic sense, what we describe as levels of personality organization. They're the healthier personality organizations. And these correspond to what people may be better familiar with, defense mechanisms. There are healthy defense mechanisms. There are less healthy defense mechanisms. The healthier, mature defense mechanisms include things like altruition and those sorts of things. And those are what we call, those would be used by people who are, how we describe it, organized at a more mature level. Then we have the kind of neurotic level of personality organization, which still lies on the healthier side of the spectrum. These people, they have intact reality testing. They use neurotic-based defenses, which are, again, considered relatively healthy. They have consolidated identities. They know who they are. They understand how they relate to other people. Those are what we describe as object relations, an object being a person. I'm an object, you're an object. People are referred to as quote unquote objects. So they understand where they begin and end. They understand where other people begin and end. And then we have, so those people generally do not commit mass murder or mass shootings. In the context of a very acute stress, one can then start using more immature defenses and kind of function at a lower level personality organization. But for the most part, these people aren't the people who are going to commit mass shootings and mass murder and those sorts of things. Then we move into what we refer to as less mature, less highly functioning levels of personality organization. The borderline organization, then at the lower end, the psychotic level of the organization. These people use splitting-based defenses like splitting, projection, projective identification, those sorts of things. They tend to have something that we call identity diffusion. Their object relations aren't good. They don't have as good of a sense of where they begin and end and where other people begin and end. They don't have as stable a sense of themselves. And the reality testing is impaired. People at the borderline level of organization tend to have relatively good reality testing, though their reality testing is not quite as stable as someone with a higher level of personality organization. So it doesn't take quite as much stress to impair the reality testing. And then at the psychotic level of organization, again, from the personality organization framework, not from the DSM Axis 1, speaking of DSM-4 more so, but Axis 1 description of and categorical description of diseases. So the psychotic people who function at a psychotic level of personality organization have poor reality testing, use psychotic level defenses, and have severe identity diffusion. So there are a number of people who go through life, and certainly most people who go through life with a borderline or even a psychotic level of personality organization, certainly who don't commit mass murder and perpetrate these sorts of things. But there are some who are more susceptible, again, because of nature or nurture or other things, who are, as we discussed, confronted with some sort of severe acute stress, are unable to handle it and act out.
Yeah. It's a great review of kind of that psychodynamic organization of neurotic, borderline, psychotic, and I would add borderline here is not borderline personality disorder.
Right.
And it's more like what defenses they're choosing, what their reality testing is. So you're saying although these people have more of the psychotic level of personality organization, they don't meet a criteria for like a specific mental illness. Like they don't have schizophrenia, they don't have bipolar. And so the majority of them do not have a mental illness proper, like a DSM diagnosis. Is that what you're saying?
Thanks for clarifying. This is an important distinction. Everyone has a personality. No one's personality is perfect. We all function at different levels of personality organization. This is completely distinct from mental illness per se. Mental illness, which is much more, it's categorical, even if it's not categorical and it lies along a spectrum. We're not talking about mental illness here. We're talking about a different way of thinking about one's personality organization or character structure. This is completely different from mental illness. And this gets more into what, like you said, a lot of people who aren't steeped in this sort of thing or have been taught these sorts of things might not understand. Again, we all have personalities and we all have defense mechanisms and ways of interact. This is all about basically just ways of interacting with the world. Yep. And this is how we in the kind of psychodynamic field, or who were taught psychodynamic theory, think about personality structure and again, behavior and how we interact with the world, motives, and what determines behavior and what we decide to do and what we decide not to do, what we want to do, what we decide not to do. There are many other ways of looking at it. For example, there are other ways of looking at it also, but this is kind of the psychodynamic perspective on just basic drives and motivations and behavior and character structure.
I think at this point, I've heard Joe Rogan a couple times say, either on Twitter or somewhere else, and this just annoys me to no end, that there's all these people committing these mass murders on medications, and it's the medications that cause the mass murders. Or at least that's the way it seems like he's talking about it. Where I was looking at this, the mass shooter database, which is much smaller than yours, but it's the prior episode I did on this, and they just came out with an update, and they found that out of the 182 cases that they have, 34 were in known mental health treatment in the past 6 months. So a very small percentage in mental health treatment at all. And out of the 182, there were only 43 that had ever been prescribed psychiatric medications. The rest had no evidence of psychiatric medications. And I put on my website, actually, a list of all the medications so that you could look at all of the cases. And it's a cornucopia of medications. Like it's not like there's one class of medications that these people were on. They're on sleep meds, antipsychotics, antidepressants, Xanax, And so it's, as I look at this list, there's no sort of theme, like, oh, it's SSRIs, right? Anything that you can add on like medications being the cause of these events, or, the lack of mental health treatment that most of these people go through prior to the events?
This is such a great question. It's so important, and I'll be so bold as to say that, in my eyes, obviously, people are going to disagree with me, but again, in my eyes, there's no debate about this, and this just goes again to the role of mental illness in mass shootings, or in this case, or in my estimation, the lack of the role of mental illness in these sorts of things. I can tell you definitively that psychiatric medications play no role in mass shootings and mass murder. I can be so definitive because I've examined 1,800 of these. And very few, I could probably count them on, I mean, we're talking about we're talking about a couple of percents maybe, uh, or less are on medications. A lot of them who are taking medications at the time of the event were not really taking them. I've reviewed some of these also, and in some cases, what they would say, the report was actually that they found traces of some sort of psychiatric medication in the person's blood. But what people might not realize is that the blood levels of those medications were very low, essentially subtherapeutic, so not therapeutic. So the person really wasn't taking the medication; they were actually untreated. As everybody in the field knows, if there's any risk of violence among people with mental illness, and again, that risk is only slightly higher among people with mental illness than not, that it's almost exclusively among unmedicated people. So one, I can be so definitive about this because the number of mass murders and mass shooters who are actively taking therapeutic doses of medications, this doesn't include people who may be misusing them, like someone who may be severely abusing a medication that can be abused wouldn't count. But the number of people taking psychiatric medications who perpetrate mass murder is about 1 or 2% total. You mentioned the number from the people from the Violence Project. They have a great database. They've done so much in this field. We cite their work. They're really fantastic. The only difference I would say, you mentioned a slightly higher number. The reason why their number is slightly higher is because they have in their database a sample that is representative of an important subgroup of mass shooters, and that is the subgroup of mass shooters whom we are most familiar with and who tend to receive the most attention in the media. It is also the case, as you're probably aware, that people who have mental illness, or let me put it the other way, mass shootings or mass murder that are perpetrated by people who have mental illness tend to receive the most media attention. They receive more media attention than mass murder and mass shootings perpetrated by people who don't have mental illness. And a lot of the mass murders and mass shootings that have received the most attention, or these ones that have received the most attention, do have a disproportionately high number of people who might have had mental illness. Again, it's not very high, but it's higher than what the real number is, and that may be contributing to these different numbers. Either way, that's why it's helpful to have groups and larger numbers and whatnot. So I can tell you definitively, we've reviewed 1,800 of these. Literally 1 or 2% are on therapeutic doses of medications. And I will go a step further. My research focus is on psychopharmacology, or the study of psychiatric medications. And there is a wealth of data to suggest that psychiatric medications specifically improve impulse control. Their direct effect is to improve impulse control. There's a wealth of data to support this. So that's why I can say definitively that there is essentially no debate about this. Yep. Psychiatric medications do not contribute to mass shootings and mass murder.
Yeah, that's good. I think I'm still sort of thinking about this, like the personality organization, them being more on the borderline or psychotic personality organization. So higher impulse control, higher denial, more primitive defenses. So more projective identification, more, blaming other people for their own stuff, rather than sort of taking responsibility for their own emotions, putting it on other people, projecting it out there. When I think about these people, they may not be like the prototypical like person that's going to come into your office, but I still think that they would really benefit from prolonged psychotherapy. Any thoughts on that?
I agree with you 100%. That's exactly what psychotherapy is for. That's why Freud and Kernberg and Kohut and Beck and all these people are so important. I'm a medication person. That's what I do. I'm a psychopharmacologist, but I know very well that medications are great and they treat a lot of people, and they improve impulse control and these sorts of things. But psychotherapy is just as important as medications, if not more important. I mean, I recommend that to almost all of my patients. And it is only through psychotherapy that a lot of these dynamics and struggles and difficulties with identity diffusion can be treated.
Can you just define identity diffusion? Because I think it might be a term that people haven't heard before.
Sure. Yeah, to say it in a way that is maybe less technical. Identity diffusion involves a lot of things, but identity diffusion is in how one values oneself. I know that I'm valuable because I'm a person and because I have thoughts and feelings, and these feelings are valuable. Just because I'm just imbued from birth with these sorts of values and characteristics. I know the same thing about you. You are valuable, and what you think and feel is valuable because you are who you are, and you're an independent person, and it's okay to have those sorts of things, whether we disagree or not. And that's just normal. And what you think about yourself for me doesn't affect me in any way, or my value or my worth, and and vice versa. Someone with identity diffusion wouldn't think that way. Someone with identity diffusion would value themselves not solely based on their own self-worth, which itself might be lacking, but they would put too much emphasis on what other people think about them, how other people treat them, and vice versa. They would use defense mechanisms such as projective identification, which you basically already just described, but that is where that's a situation in which I attribute my feelings, which, if we're talking about mass shootings and mass shooters, could be that unconsciously I feel that I have little self-worth, I have little value to give to society or anyone. But rather than sit with those feelings, think about why I feel that, and understand that those feelings are coming from me, I would, again, because there's identity diffusion and there's not much of a boundary or border between you and me, I would project those feelings onto you, those feelings about me onto you, so that it's no longer me who thinks that I'm of no value and I have low self-worth and I can't offer much to other people. I would think that that's you thinking those things. And now you're the bad object or bad person. You're the one who doesn't think I'm valuable. You're the one who thinks I'm a bad person or isn't worth anything. That's kind of a description of, or one example of identity diffusion and projective identification in action.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate that. Okay, let's move on to kind of like what you think about kind of the culture and the acculturation and violence, like in movies and video games. And when I interviewed the people from the mass shooter database, they talked about how they didn't think that there was an association between like violent video games and mass shooting. But it seemed like you kind of thought that media played a role to some degree. Can you maybe share with me your thoughts and where you get your thoughts?
Sure. This is very important. It's not just about video games, but video games are certainly part of media. I'll describe this in a few ways. So as we mentioned before, the rate of mass shootings and mass murder in general, but let's just talk about mass shootings. was stable between 1900 and 1970, and then increased fourfold after 1970. One can speculate as to why this is the case, but this suggests, and all the other data that we discussed and data that we haven't discussed, suggests that it's just that gun availability is important. There's no doubt gun availability is important. But to go into this a little bit more, one other thing we showed in our paper is that other methods of perpetrating mass murder actually result in many more fatalities than guns. So a lot of people think that people use guns to commit mass murder because guns kill the most people. Guns are extremely deadly. However, there actually are other methods which are quite available and can be more destructive. Yet people choose guns. Gun violence and mass shootings dominate mass murders in general. So the question is, why are people choosing guns when there are potentially other methods that are maybe more deadly and even potentially very available or even more available? So why are people still choosing guns? So number one, I want to mention this suggests that managing gun availability is an even bigger issue, because people will choose guns. People just want to use guns. It's not just that they want to cause damage and commit mass murder. It's that they want to use guns to commit mass murder. That's critical. And this might seem like oh yeah, isn't that obvious? But this is, I think, one of the most important observations from our study, and that it's that people don't just want to kill; they want to particularly commit this mass murder using guns. There's something
Interesting.
There's something about guns.
As you say that, it's almost like it's more personal than just a bomb going off.
Exactly.
It's more like, I am causing this. I'm shooting this thing at you, and you are dying. It's like it seems much more sort of visceral than a bomb being placed and then getting away from the bomb, And also much more like, oh, I'm the cause of this, if they're looking for notoriety, it's like, there's no doubt who caused this.
There is a like we said, a romanticization of gun violence in general and mass shootings. So what happened around 1970? So there are issues with gun availability and those types of things, which are very important. We need to manage gun availability. Part of that, though, even more upstream, and again, we need to manage gun availability. That will make a difference because that is one constant. But how do we manage this romanticization of gun violence? Or how do we even know that romanticization of gun violence is an issue, or the culture of gun violence is an issue? And before 1970, the primary influences on young people in general, but young people in particular, were the family, or parents and teachers. They were the primary influences. It wasn't until the 70s, 80s, 90s, and obviously today, where the primary influences on young people especially became the media. So they're the primary influences. The media, and we're talking about movies and television and video games and these sorts of things.
Yep.
The music industry. They romanticize. They romanticize violence, gun violence, those sorts of things. It's not just a matter of, it's these things are romanticized and they need to stop. So back to the specific association that you mentioned between video games and mass shootings or gun violence. These effects are cultural. They affect culture. They're not. These sort of effects wouldn't be seen on an individual basis. For example, I've read some of these studies examining relationships between violent video games and gun violence and people who've perpetrated gun violence. And basically what they show is that, several previous studies showed an association, but there were some more recent studies which were, well conducted. The studies themselves were fine. It's just important to interpret them, the right way. Basically what these studies showed is that there wasn't necessarily a higher prevalence of playing violent video games among people who were violent than people who weren't violent. And so the conclusion made was that, there's no relationship between video games and violence and those sorts of things. So again, these effects are not necessarily one-to-one direct effects. They are effects on culture. So music affects our culture, video games affect the culture, movies affect the culture. I wouldn't have had to seen one specific movie or played one specific video game or played any amount of video games for something to affect me, because these effects are seen across cultures. For example, just within psychiatry, like we said, I was trained in psychodynamic psychotherapy. That's how I think about things. That when I administered therapy or conducted psychotherapy, that's the type of therapy I administer. That doesn't mean that I and what I learned were not affected by other fields of psychotherapy and other practitioners of psychotherapy and other theories. I mean, we were, because all of these are related. They're not, siloed and completely independent. The same way that the video game industry and the movie industry and music industry and television are all related. So if one becomes maybe a little more violent, the other will become a little more violent. If one romanticizes gun violence a little more, the other will. So that's kind of how we see things. Again, I'm trying not to use specific details. I don't want to be too ambiguous. I'm trying not to use specific details or examples, because I don't want to, I don't want to, bring up specific examples or people or games or movies or those sorts of things. But I hope the examples that we're using are clear and explanatory enough.
Yeah, I do think I do think that it's like maybe for the vast majority of people, it doesn't impact them, or they're not being more violent because of these things. Actually, I think violence has had a precipitous drop since the Middle Ages, and a precipitous drop from like maybe 20,000 years ago. I mean, there's data to support like 50% of men were killed by other men, like because their bones had like axe wounds to them, and stuff like that, like old ancient archaeological bones that they've dug up. Like 50% looks like male on male trauma, right?
Wow.
So you think about like how homicide has decreased over time, and I think it's actually very hopeful. I think like it's like, or at least like the very cognitive, like the part of me that's like can look at statistics and be detached from it, Yet you would never know that looking at our like the movies that we watch. It's like violence is very common, or the video games that we play. It's like I've kind of decided this year to detach my kids from media on the weekdays completely, like no media. And it's interesting. Well, not a lot, but I've had a lot of patients over the years who are like in Silicon Valley and, part of different big companies there that produce media, or, social media. And a lot of them raise their kids with no social media,
Wow,
like
really?
I've never had a higher end person at one of these companies who says, yeah, I let my kids have Instagram from the age of like 10, never. It's always like, no, I specifically chose the school because they don't have computers and because they don't do media and screens. So it's interesting. There's this parallel that I see between like people who are in the field producing that content, not allowing their kids to do it. And so we have to have some wisdom as parents, right? If any of the audience members are parents, like how much media should we allow? And we did a 2-week vacation, which is very unusual. I think it was the first 2-week vacation I've ever taken. And I said to my wife, the one thing I want is no media. for the kids.
Wow.
And so the whole time, and lo and behold, the kids, like after the first couple days, they stopped arguing as much. They were, of course, you had two parents at bay, so maybe that had an influence. And we're in nature, so maybe that had an influence, but they were like having a great time together, and we had meals, all meals were together. And so I think it's a good message of like constraining our media for ourselves and for our kids.
I think what you're saying is that a lot of this is intuitive. One doesn't even necessarily need to know the data or be a psychiatric researcher or a person who researches mass murder to know that some of these things are just intuitive. Some of these strategies are intuitive. I think is that about right?
Intuitive and like there's some practical like before we like try to fix you know some large system that we have no control over. Let's work on our own media consumption, our own
Right. Right.
family media consumption. So that I'm always thinking about like what do I actually have the power to control? Like and move into more of a self-efficacious place rather than like, oh, this external stuff is going on and we have no control over it. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. Change starts with each one of us, the individual. I can make the most. I can have the most effects or make the most difference myself, and whatnot. So yeah, I agree with you 100%. We all need to take responsibility for this sort of thing as much as we can. Obviously, there's only so much we can do, but yes.
Yeah. I think and I think as mental health clinicians, we get people into our office that there may be those people that you're like, wow, there's something about this person that I'm a little bit more concerned about. Like when you think about mass shooting, there's two patients I've had in my whole career that like raise my sort of like, okay, if there were anyone who would, of any of my patients that would commit these crimes, it would be these two people.
I see.
And trying to maybe get them the treatment that they need, because I do think that one in particular responded to about 7 years of therapy, and me as a clinician got him in with the resident clinic for a number of years, and I think he really did respond. And the other guy was a little bit more difficult, and I think he did really value the therapy he was in. It was at a college I was helping out with, and I was his psychiatrist, and he had a therapist, and just keeping him in therapy, it was like his one person, because he was kind of odd. It was hard for him to connect with other human beings. He got angry, he got defensive very quickly. He seemed very impulsive, and he kind of had this more cold, less warm aspect to him, but he really valued the connection. And so I think part of the work that we could do is like, how do we work through our own countertransference if we have someone in our office that maybe is a little bit more off-putting, a little bit harder to connect with. The first patient, he had some racist views. He had some racist tattoos on him. When he was manic, he actually became very racist. And I won't say too many specifics, but it was very off-putting to a lot of the residents at first. But when he was well controlled with antipsychotic and lithium, he eventually wanted to get rid of those tattoos, and he actually married someone of the race at which he was prejudiced against, which was also kind of interesting.
I think what you're speaking to is critical, and it kind of synthesizes a lot of what we've discussed, in particular about mental illness, but even outside of mental illness, because people who don't have, again, categorical definitions or the categorical descriptions of mental illness can benefit. But I think what you're saying, again, this kind of synthesizes everything or captures a lot of what we've been saying, and that is that, just having people in treatment is so helpful. So medicating people helps. We know that. These mass murders, mass shooters, for the most part, I mean, almost exclusively are not taking medication. If any of them were to start a medication, they would almost definitely improve. But also therapy, just being in treatment helps so much. Whether someone has, depression or psychosis or anxiety disorder or anything, just being in treatment, therapy in and of itself helps, but just being in treatment, we know goes a long way towards helping mental illness in general and these sorts of things. To describe it in a psychodynamic sense, there are basically three hurdles to any sort of major bad behavior. We can include mass shootings among that, but for a person with mental illness or otherwise, one is one's own inhibitions or limitations. Conscience, or if one's religious, God, or ego functions, if one thinks about this from a psychodynamic perspective. The second is the hurdle of the inhibitions or the moral system that we internalize from those people around us. Those could be our parents, partners, close friends, or our clinicians, our therapists or psychiatrists. So people who may not have, the strongest egos in the psychiatric sense of the world, can internalize the ego's functions, in this case, let's say impulse control, of their clinician, whether they're getting medications or in a formal psychotherapy, which certainly will help. That's so important. That's why we as a field care so much about getting people into treatment. We, just like you said, it's just about getting people into treatment. The treatment will then take care of itself. And obviously people have to get good treatment, but whether it's medications or therapy, or whatever, having that relationship with a good object, the psychiatrist, the therapist, whatever, in and of itself is so therapeutic, is so helpful, and can help a lot of these things, even for people who don't have a categorically defined or described mental illness.
Yep. And then were you going to say a third thing? Because I think you said
the third thing. So sure.
So okay,
conscience or our own inhibitions or moral system or
and
whatever you want to describe it.
Kind of like a super ego function, or like a set of rules coming from culture, individuals, mentors. And yeah, what was
the second would be that which we internalize from those closest to us. Then the third would be society or culture.
Okay.
That we understand, these can be the police. We know we don't want to get in trouble, or these can be that we understand that society wouldn't accept this, or we understand that this is, frowned upon or whatever. But once, gun violence or, gun culture is romanticized or accepted or whatever, that third hurdle is not as high and becomes a problem.
And I would say to that third one, the myths and the stories that we tell our kids, and are so important, and to control that to some degree. It's like, so instead of media, I read my kids The Hobbit, and I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what morals were going to come out of that, but lo and behold, like, it is amazing in how it talks about greed, and how it talks about selflessness, and how it talks about courage. And so I'm having those conversations with my kids, and my kids are young, 6 and 8 years old. It was a great book to read to them. And it's those types of like stories, I think, that get like imprinted and that we need, right? So you think about the stories of the society, and I want to do more of this in the future in my podcast, talking about like Achilles and the Iliad and the Odyssey. And, there's aspects of what is courage, what is forgiveness. With Achilles, you have this kind of like very sort of narcissistic character, but at one point he does this forgiving act, which kind of becomes a central point of the Iliad. And so like there's these myths that have been told to whole, you imagine the young people of those of that day, and these myths informed them, And so I think it's really important that we think about this as parents. Like, what stories are we telling our kids to teach them these lessons, and not just leave it up to some YouTube, person playing Minecraft, which my kids love to watch, to sort of enculturate them into what is right and wrong. You know what I mean?
The best stories for children, but for all of us, have these strong moral values within them, or systems.
Yeah.
Good versus evil, right versus right and wrong. Those sorts of things. Those are generally the most popular stories because we unconsciously or consciously, but certainly unconsciously, uh, understand the difference between right or wrong, whether we behave in commensurate way, but we understand unconsciously what is right and wrong, and that just kind of jives with us. And so, of course, we're most attracted to stories that involve strong kind of moral messages.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a good place to stop. This has been a really good discussion. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. If you're on Twitter, is that a good place to sort of see what you're up to? Is that where you'd like to leave? What's your Twitter handle?
I'm not on Twitter, actually.
You're
I'm
off
not
that.
on Twitter.
Okay.
But people can find out about what we do and reach me very easily by just typing in my name, first or last name, and Columbia, as for Columbia University, and they will be immediately directed to my webpage, which has my contact information, email address, information about me and what we do in our research here and with the mass shooting database. And we've published one paper, another has been accepted. We're going to be publishing a few more in the next few months to years. So,
Yep.
so
And I'll link that paper in the article that we will post, which I hope you'll first author on my website, psychiatrypodcast.com, and it'll be in the resource library. So if anyone wants to dig into that article, I'll link that there. And so thank you so much for coming on. I think it's really helpful to have someone who's both a clinician, trained in psychiatry, but also doing the research and, spending the thousands of hours digging into this stuff so that we can get a closer glimpse of reality. So I appreciate that.
thanks for having me on, David, and having a discussion about these sorts of topics, which are very difficult to talk about.
All right. We'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.